Whispers echo louder than screams in the upper echelons of Manhattan society. Betrayal is usually served behind closed mahogany doors, padded with ironclad non-disclosure agreements and multi-million-dollar hush money. Yet, Arthur Remington decided to parade his infidelity under the dazzling chandeliers of the season's most prestigious charity ball, entirely convinced his quiet, long-suffering wife would simply stay home, hide, and weep. It was devastatingly wrong. Tonight is not a story of a broken marriage or a tearful divorce. Tonight is an absolute masterclass in calculated vengeance. Buckle up, because high society is about to witness a demolition disguised in haute couture, and the glittering wreckage will be nothing short of spectacular. Manhattan's elite operate on a very specific currency, and it is not just money. It is leverage, optics, and the unspoken rules of the game. For 15 years, Clara Remington had been the undisputed queen of this chessboard. As the wife of Arthur Remington, the billionaire titan behind Remington Global Logistics, Clara was the picture of aristocratic grace. She was a woman who spoke softly, curated the finest art collections in their Fifth Avenue penthouse, and chaired boards with a velvet fist. But over the past 8 months, the velvet had begun to fray, not by her own doing, but because of her husband's blinding midlife hubris. Enter Isabella Rossi. At 26, Isabella was a fiercely ambitious public relations executive who had been hired to modernize Remington Global's corporate image. She was sharp, undeniably gorgeous, and possessed a ruthless hunger that Arthur mistook for passion. What began as late-night strategy meetings in Arthur's glass corner office quickly devolved into weekend business retreats in Aspen and poorly concealed dinners at Le Bernardin. By October, the affair was the worst-kept secret in New York. The gossip columns were having a field day. Blind items practically spelled out their names, referencing the logistics king and his PR princess. Isabella, intoxicated by the proximity to billions, began to leak breadcrumbs to the press herself. A photo of her holding a distinctly recognizable rare Birkin bag, one Clara had famously declined at auction, surfaced on her social media. A strategic paparazzi shot caught Arthur kissing Isabella's cheek outside the Mark Hotel. The public narrative shifted swiftly. Clara was painted as the fading, out-of-touch wife, clinging to a marriage that was already functionally dead. Isabella was the shiny modern replacement, the woman who had captured the billionaire's rejuvenated heart. Arthur, entirely blinded by ego and Isabella's adoration, began to fundamentally disrespect the rules of his society. He assumed Clara would demand a quiet divorce, take a generous settlement, and retreat to their estate in the Hamptons. He believed her silence over the past few months was a sign of defeat. He had no idea that Clara's silence was simply the quiet before an utter hurricane. In the sprawling master suite of their penthouse, Clara stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. The trees were stripped bare, shivering in the November wind. Her phone buzzed on the marble vanity. It was Richard Davies, her personal attorney, a man whose hourly rate was higher than most people's annual rent. "The final documents are ready, Clara." Richard's voice was crisp, lacking any unnecessary sympathy. He knew better than to pity her. The structural shift in the holding company has been executed. He didn't even read the riders on the last merger agreement. "Arthur never reads the riders," Clara said, her voice smooth, betraying zero emotion. "He only looks at the bottom line. And the board, they are fully briefed. They are simply waiting for your signal." "But Clara," Richard paused, a hint of genuine curiosity bleeding into his professional tone, "are you entirely sure about tonight?" "The optics. Arthur has confirmed he is bringing Miss Rossi as his +1 to the Global Children's Trust Gala. He is co-chairing. It will be a media circus." "I am counting on it being a circus, Richard," Clara replied, turning away from the window. "A circus needs a ringmaster. I will see you on Monday for the final execution." She ended the call. Tonight was the Global Children's Trust Gala, the crown jewel of the winter social season. Arthur had boldly informed Clara that they should live separate lives, and had the audacity to suggest she sit this event out to avoid awkwardness. He intended to formally introduce Isabella to their world, a soft launch of his future ex-wife's replacement. Clara walked into her massive dressing room, where her legendary stylist, a brilliant Parisian named Laurent, was waiting alongside a seamstress. In the center of the room, hanging from a velvet mannequin, was a garment that defied description. It was not merely a dress, it was a weapon. "Is it ready, Laurent?" Clara asked. Laurent beamed, his eyes shining with tears of pure aesthetic joy. "Madam, it is a masterpiece. When you walk into that ballroom, the air will leave their lungs." Clara traced the intricate shimmering beadwork with one manicured finger. She wasn't going to the gala to cry. She wasn't going to cause a screaming match. She was going to rewrite history. The flashing of cameras outside the Pierre Hotel looked like a localized lightning storm. The red carpet for the Global Children's Trust Gala was lined with barricades, holding back desperate paparazzi and onlookers braving the biting New York cold. A sleek black Maybach glided to a halt at the edge of the carpet. The rear door was opened by a white-gloved attendant, and Arthur Remington stepped out. At 52, he was handsome in a rugged, heavily groomed manner, wearing a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo. He turned and offered his hand to the woman inside. Isabella Rossi emerged, and the flashbulbs exploded in a blinding frenzy. She had dressed for a coronation. Isabella wore a custom scarlet gown that left very little to the imagination, a plunging neckline, a slit up to the thigh, and a train that swept aggressively across the carpet. It was loud, expensive, and screamed for attention. Around her neck sat a heavy, sparkling diamond collar, a recent gift from Arthur that had cost him the equivalent of a small island. Isabella clung to Arthur's arm, posing for the cameras with a practiced, radiant smile. She felt utterly invincible. She was walking the most exclusive carpet in the city on the arm of a billionaire. She had usurped the untouchable Clara Remington. In Isabella's mind, the war was already over, and she had won the spoils. Inside the grand ballroom, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of white orchids, expensive perfume, and vicious whispered gossip. The room was populated by old money families, tech innovators, and political heavyweights. As Arthur and Isabella made their way down the grand staircase, heads turned. The murmurs rose like a swarm of bees. Eleanor DuPont, the formidable matriarch of a banking dynasty and a woman who wielded social implications like a guillotine, stood near the champagne fountain. She leaned towards Cynthia Davenport, the charity's chairwoman. "Good heavens," Eleanor whispered, her eyes tracking Isabella's scarlet train. "He actually brought the concubine, and she's wearing red. How terribly subtle." "It's vulgar," Cynthia agreed, her lips drawn into a tight, disapproving line. "Arthur has lost his mind to disrespect Clara so publicly. I thought Clara was going to attend, but I suppose she couldn't bear the humiliation." "Can you blame her?" Arthur paraded Isabella through the room, introducing her to business associates and hesitant socialites. Isabella played the part of the charming, vibrant young professional, laughing too loudly and holding her champagne flute a little too tightly. She noticed the cold stares from women like Eleanor DuPont, but she brushed them off as mere jealousy. They were old and fading. She was the future. "You look stunning, my love," Arthur whispered, kissing her temple as they stood near the main stage. "They love you. They're just intimidated," Isabella cooed, tracing the lapel of his tuxedo. "This is our night, Arthur. We don't have to hide anymore." The evening progressed to the formal dinner. Arthur and Isabella were seated at table 1, the center of gravity in the room. Speeches began celebrating the millions raised for pediatric hospitals. Arthur, as co-chair, gave a rousing speech, thanking the donors and speaking about new beginnings and looking to the future, phrases that everyone in the room knew were thinly veiled references to his new relationship. Isabella watched him from the table, beaming with pride. As Arthur concluded his speech to polite applause and returned to his seat, a sudden, inexplicable hush began to wash over the ballroom. It didn't happen all at once. It started near the grand entrance at the back of the hall and rippled forward, wave by wave, as if someone had pulled the plug on the room's ambient noise. The clinking of silver forks against china stopped. The string quartet, playing softly in the corner, faltered for a fraction of a second before finding their rhythm again. Arthur frowned, looking up from his prime rib. Isabella turned around in her chair, annoyed by the sudden shift in energy. The heavy double doors of the ballroom stood wide open. The maître, usually a stoic figure, looked visibly stunned. Standing in the archway, bathed in the soft glow of the corridor chandeliers, was Clara Remington. If Isabella's arrival was a loud, desperate shout for attention, Clara's entrance was a deafening, terrifying silence. She did not rush. She stepped into the ballroom with the slow, predatory grace of a queen reclaiming the usurped throne. The crowd instinctively parted, creating a wide, unobstructed path directly to table 1. The dress was a marvel of fashion history, and everyone in the room who understood true wealth recognized it instantly. It was not a flashy, off-the-rack designer piece. It was an archival vintage Givenchy haute couture gown from the late 1990s, entirely encrusted in black onyx beads and spun silver thread. It fit Clara like a second skin, elegant, severe, and devastatingly beautiful. It caught the light not with a cheap sparkle, but with a dark, commanding iridescence. But it was not the dress that made Eleanor Dupont gasp aloud. It was the jewelry. Resting against Clara's collarbone was the Remington Imperial Emerald. It was a flawless, 50-carat square-cut emerald, surrounded by flawless canary diamonds, a legendary piece that Arthur's grandfather had purchased from a displaced royal family in the 1920s. It was the absolute symbol of the Remington family legacy. Suddenly, the massive diamond collar around Isabella's neck looked like cheap glass baubles bought at a department store. Clara's hair was swept into a razor-sharp chignon, her makeup flawless, her expression completely unreadable. She walked down the center aisle, her silver heels making a sharp, rhythmic click, click, click against the marble floor. The entire room of 500 people held their breath. Arthur froze, his face draining of all color. He stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his wineglass. "Clara," he choked her, his voice barely carrying over the silence. Isabella stared, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had spent months convincing herself that Clara was a weak, irrelevant old woman. The woman standing before her was a terrifying titan. Isabella felt completely naked in her loud red dress, instantly aware that she looked exactly like what she was, a mistress trying entirely too hard. Clara stopped at table 1. She did not look at Isabella. She didn't even acknowledge the younger woman's existence, stripping Isabella of any power or relevance in a single, devastating omission. Clara only looked at Arthur. "Arthur," Clara said. Her voice was perfectly modulated, pitched low, but carrying a crystalline clarity that reached the surrounding tables. "You seem surprised. I distinctly remember RSVPing to my own charity." "Clara, what are you doing here?" Arthur hissed, trying to maintain a smile for the hundreds of eyes boring into them. "We discussed this. You agreed to stay home, did I?" Clara tilted her head, a macroscopic, chilling smile playing on her lips. "I must have misremembered. Or perhaps I simply realized that as the majority shareholder of Remington Global, my absence at an event sponsored by my company would send the wrong message to the board. Arthur blinked, his brain struggling to process her words. Majority shareholder. Clara, what are you talking about? I hold 51%. You held 51%, Arthur, Clara corrected gently, as if speaking to a slow child, until you leveraged a massive portion of your personal shares to fund that disastrous acquisition in Dubai last quarter. An acquisition you needed immediate capital for. Arthur's face turned a sickening shade of grey. I borrowed against them. I didn't sell them. You borrowed against them through a blind holding firm, yes. Clara's smile widened just a fraction. The surrounding tables were dead silent, hanging on to every single syllable. A holding firm called Apex Capital. I bought Apex Capital 3 weeks ago, Arthur, when you defaulted on the margin call yesterday afternoon, because I instructed the firm to accelerate the terms. As permitted by the rider, you failed to read your shares defaulted to the firm. To me, Isabella, finally finding her voice, tried to interject. Arthur, what is she saying? Tell her to leave. Clara slowly turned her gaze to Isabella. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet 10 degrees. Clara looked at the red dress, the desperate diamonds, and then into Isabella's panicked eyes. Ms. Rossi, Clara said, her tone devoid of malice, which somehow made it infinitely worse. It was the tone of a person addressing a pest. Your contract with Remington Global's PR department was terminated an hour ago. You are officially trespassing at a corporate-sponsored event. I suggest you collect your coat. You can't do that, Isabella shrieked, her carefully cultivated higher society facade shattering into a million pieces. She looked at Arthur. Arthur, do something. Arthur was hyperventilating, his eyes darting between Clara and the faces of his peers watching him unravel. Clara, this is insane. We built this company together. You wouldn't destroy me over indiscretion, Clara finished for him. She stepped slightly closer, dropping her voice so only he and Isabella could hear the final nail being driven into the coffin. I don't care who you speak with, Arthur. I care that you made me look like a fool. I care that you paraded your midlife crisis through my city, dragging the company's reputation and my family's name through the tabloids. She reached out and lightly tapped the center of his chest. I am not destroying you, Arthur. You handed me the sledgehammer, and I am simply swinging it. By Monday morning, the board will vote you out as CEO. I already have the proxy votes. You will step down, and you will fade away, or I will initiate a hostile takeover that will leave you with nothing but the clothes on your back, and whatever loose change is in your pocket. Clara took a deliberate step back, smoothing the front of her flawless Givenchy gown. She looked around the room, acknowledging Eleanor Dupont with a respectful, subtle nod. Eleanor, visibly thrilled by the spectacle, nodded back. Now, Clara said brightly, her voice returning to its normal, elegant volume. I believe the auction is about to begin. If you'll excuse me, Arthur, I have a paddle to raise. Enjoy the rest of your evening. It is bound to be your last one in this room. Without waiting for a response, Clara turned her back on her husband and his mistress. She walked toward the empty seat at the head of the table, pulling it out and sitting down with immaculate posture. Arthur stood frozen, the reality of his utter annihilation crashing over him. Isabella stood beside him, clutching his arm, but Arthur suddenly yanked his arm away, looking at her as if she were poison. The woman he thought was a trophy had cost him his entire empire. The whispers in the ballroom resumed, no longer a quiet hum, but a roar. The king was dead. Long live the queen. The auctioneer, a seasoned professional from Sotheby's, cleared his throat, desperately trying to recalibrate the energy in the grand ballroom. He stepped up to the podium, his microphone amplifying a slight tremor in his voice. Ladies and gentlemen, if we could please take our seats. We have a spectacular array of lots this evening, beginning with a private 2-week charter aboard the super yacht Oceanus, sailing the Amalfi coast. No one was looking at the auctioneer. 500 pairs of eyes were locked in a dangerous, shifting dance between Clara, who sat sipping sparkling water with the serenity of a meditating monk, and Arthur, who was currently drowning on dry land. Arthur's first instinct was survival. He abandoned Isabella by the ice sculpture and marched directly toward table 4, where Jonathan Abernathy and William Hastings sat. They were his two oldest allies on the Remington Global Board, men he played golf with at Shinnecock Hills every summer. "Jonathan, Bill," Arthur said, his voice tight, attempting a jovial, conspiratorial tone. "Can you believe this theatrics? Clara is clearly having a nervous breakdown. I'll need both of your proxies on Monday to squash this ridiculous." Jonathan Abernathy did not even let Arthur finish his sentence. He slowly picked up his linen napkin, wiped the corner of his mouth, and stood up. He did not look Arthur in the eye. "Come along, Margaret," Jonathan said to his wife. "I believe the air in this corner of the room has become entirely too stale." William Hastings followed suit, refusing to acknowledge Arthur's outstretched hand. Within 30 seconds, table 4 was completely empty. Arthur staggered back, the reality of his situation calcifying in his chest. In Manhattan, power is not measured by the balance in your checking account. It is measured by who will answer your phone call. Tonight, Arthur Remington had become radioactive. Social contagion had set in, and Clara had engineered it so flawlessly that to associate with Arthur was to declare war on the new, undisputed monarch of Remington Global. Across the room, Isabella Rossi was experiencing her own terrifying awakening. She stood near the perimeter, her scarlet gown suddenly feeling less like a crown and more like a target. She watched as Arthur, the man who had promised her the world, was systematically shunned by the very people he claimed to rule. The older women in the room were no longer throwing her icy glares. They were openly pointing and laughing. Eleanor DuPont was practically vibrating with glee, whispering behind a gloved hand to a cluster of socialites who were sketching out the blueprint of Arthur's ruin. Isabella pulled out her phone. Her hands were shaking violently. She opened her banking app, checking the platinum credit card Arthur had given her for incidental expenses. Account suspended. A cold sweat broke out across the back of her neck. She checked the joint account he had set up for their impending move into a Tribeca loft. Access denied. Please contact your administrator. No, she muttered, tapping the screen frantically. She looked up and saw Arthur storming toward her. His face was flushed, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though his teeth might shatter. "We are leaving," Arthur hissed, grabbing her elbow with a grip that bruised. "Arthur, you're hurting me," she snapped, yanking her arm away. "What is happening? What did she mean about the shares? Why is my card suspended?" "Not now, Isabella," Arthur growled, his voice a panicked whisper. "Just smile and walk to the coat check. I need to get to the office and call my attorneys." "Your attorneys?" Isabella's voice cracked. The charm and adoration she usually reserved for him evaporated, replaced by pure, feral panic. "Arthur, tell me you still have the money. Tell me this is just a bluff." Arthur stopped and looked at her. In that moment, the illusion shattered entirely. He saw her not as the vibrant muse who made him feel young, but as the reckless mistake that had cost him his empire. And Isabella saw him not as a titan of industry, but as a desperate, aging man who had been outsmarted by his wife. "Get your own coat," Arthur spat, his tone dripping with venom. He turned and practically ran toward the exit, leaving her standing alone in a sea of mocking faces. Isabella choked on a sob, hiking up the heavy train of her scarlet dress, and fled toward the lobby. She demanded the valet summon the Maybach, only to be met with a pitying look from the attendant. "I'm sorry, Miss Rossi," the valet said, checking his digital tablet. "Mrs. Remington's office called down 10 minutes ago. A corporate car service has been reassigned to her for the evening. The driver has been instructed not to accept any other passengers. Humiliation burned in her throat like battery acid. She stumbled out of the Pierre Hotel and onto the freezing pavement of Fifth Avenue. There were no waiting limousines. The paparazzi, sensing a shift in the wind, began snapping photos of her standing alone, shivering violently in her plunging gown, the massive diamond collar feeling like a heavy chain around her neck. Desperate, she hailed a passing yellow cab. The driver looked at her suspiciously as she slid into the cracked vinyl back seat, the scarlet silk of her custom gown bunching up against a discarded candy wrapper. Back in the grand ballroom, the auction had reached its climax. The final lot was a breathtaking diamond-encrusted Patek Philippe watch, donated by a legendary Swiss collector. "Do I hear 1 million?" the auctioneer called out. Clara raised her packle gracefully. 2 million, she said. Her voice was calm, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. The room fell silent. No one dared bid against her. It was not about the watch. It was a tribute. It was the entire room bowing to the victor. "Sold," the auctioneer announced, banging his gavel. "To Mrs. Clara Remington." Clara smiled a genuine, warm smile for the first time that evening. She took another sip of her sparkling water. The board was secured. The society was secured. Now she just had to take the company. Monday morning at the Remington Tower began not with the usual hum of commerce, but with the chilling silence of an impending execution. The 60th floor, home to the executive suites, was typically a fortress of Arthur's absolute power. By 7:30 a.m., Arthur had barricaded himself inside his corner office. He had spent the entire weekend desperately trying to reach his personal attorneys, financial advisors, and any board member who would pick up the phone. His calls went straight to voicemail. His emergency line of credit at Chase Manhattan had been frozen. Clara had not just taken his shares. She had systematically choked off his liquidity. At 8:45 a.m., the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. Clara walked in, wearing a sharp, impeccably tailored, charcoal Tom Ford suit. Her hair was pulled back, her face a mask of supreme corporate authority. Flanking her was Richard Davies, clutching a thick leather portfolio, and 3 forensic accountants from a notoriously ruthless firm. The 12 members of the board of directors were already seated. They did not speak as Clara took the chair at the head of the long mahogany table, the chair Arthur had occupied for 20 years. "Good morning, gentlemen," Clara said, opening her laptop. "I apologize for the abrupt change in schedule. Let us dispense with the pleasantries. We have a tremendous amount of damage control to execute." Before anyone could reply, the ballroom doors burst open. Arthur stood in the threshold, his tie askew, his eyes bloodshot and frantic. He looked like a man who had not slept in 3 days, which he hadn't. "This is an illegal assembly," Arthur shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Richard Davies. "I am the CEO of this company. I did not call this meeting, and I demand you all vacate this room immediately." Clara did not look up from her screen. "Close the doors behind you, Arthur. You're letting a draft in. And take a seat. Any seat. Except this one." Arthur marched toward her, his fists balled. "You think you can just steal my company, Clara? I built Remington Global. I made it what it is. You inherited a trucking company from your father and rode a wave of deregulation, Arthur," Clara corrected, her voice dangerously quiet. "And for the last 5 years, you have used this company as your personal piggy bank. Richard, if you would." Richard Davies stood up and began passing thick-bound dossiers to every board member. "What you have in front of you," Clara continued, addressing the board while completely ignoring her husband, "is a comprehensive forensic audit of the Dubai acquisition. As you know, Arthur leveraged 51% of his personal shares to secure the short-term capital. What he failed to disclose to this board is that he also used corporate assets to guarantee a secondary off-the-books loan to cover personal debts. Arthur went dead pale. That's a lie. That is confidential financial structuring. It is embezzlement, Clara stated flatly. You used company funds to purchase a $12 million penthouse in Tribeca on the Rochelle LLC. A penthouse intended for your public relations consultant, Ms. Rossi. You also billed the company for private jet flights to Aspen, masquerading as scouting trips for a new logistics hub. There is no logistics hub in Aspen, Arthur. Only ski slopes. The board members flicked through the dossiers, their expressions darkening with every page. The proof was irrefutable. Bank statements, signed wire transfers, and internal emails that Arthur thought he had deleted months ago. Clara had been gathering the ammunition for half a year, waiting for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. As of Friday evening, I hold to controlling interest in Remington Global, Clara announced, interlacing her fingers on the table. My first motion as majority shareholder is the immediate termination of Arthur Remington as Chief Executive Officer, effective this exact second, for gross misconduct, breach of fiduciary duty, and misappropriation of company funds. Do we have a second? Seconded, Jonathan Abernathy said instantly, not even looking up from the damning financial records. All in favor? Clara asked. 12 hands went up simultaneously. It was unanimous. It was over. Arthur slumped against the wall, the breath knocked out of him. Clara, please, he whispered, his arrogance finally shattering into pathetic desperation. I'll step down. I'll go to rehab. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't press charges. Don't leave me with nothing. Clara finally looked at him. There was no pity in her eyes. Only the cold, hard pragmatism of a surgeon removing a tumor. You left yourself with nothing, Arthur, she said. The company will not press criminal charges provided you sign over your remaining vested options to cover the stolen funds. You will receive a standard severance package, heavily taxed, and you will vacate the premises within the hour. Security is waiting outside to escort you to your office for a single box of personal items. Arthur opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He looked at the men he had called friends, men who now looked at him as if he were a rotting corpse. He turned and walked out of the boardroom, a ghost haunting the empire he once built. Meanwhile, 30 blocks south, Isabella Rossi was attempting her own desperate salvage operation. She marched into the glittering lobby of Zenith Communications, the most cutthroat PR agency in Manhattan. If Arthur was going down, she needed to spin the narrative quickly. She would sell her story as the naive victim manipulated by an older, powerful man. She had an appointment with Oliver Sinclair, Zenith's legendary crisis manager. Isabella was ushered into Oliver's office. He was a shark of a man, wearing a bespoke suit and a permanent smirk. Isabella, Oliver purred, gesturing to a leather chair. Rough weekend, I hear. Page 6 is having an absolute field day with your cab ride from the Pierre. I need representation, Oliver, Isabella said, trying to sound commanding. I have a story to tell. The truth about Arthur Remington. It's an exclusive. It will be the biggest scandal of the year, and I want to control the narrative. Oliver leaned back, steepling his fingers. He looked highly amused. A story? My dear, you don't have a story. You have a gag order. Isabella froze. What are you talking about? I never signed an NDA with Arthur regarding our personal relationship. Not with Arthur, no. Oliver smiled, pulling a single sheet of paper from his desk drawer and sliding it across the glass surface. You signed this when you were hired as an independent contractor for Remington Global Logistics. Clause 14, subsection B. Isabella picked up the paper, her eyes scanning the legal jargon. It states, Oliver provided helpfully, that any contractor engaging in a romantic, physical, or personal relationship with an executive officer forfeits all right to discuss said relationship publicly in perpetuity. Breach of this clause triggers an immediate, automatically ruled penalty of $10 million in damages to the corporation. A corporation that is now entirely controlled by Clara Remington. Isabella's stomach plummeted. She couldn't breathe. Mrs. Remington's legal team sent a messenger over with a copy for me this morning, Oliver said, picking up his pen, along with a very polite note suggesting that if any agency in this city represents you, Remington Global will pull all of their corporate accounts from that agency forever. And frankly, Isabella, Clara's retainers are worth a hell of a lot more than whatever tabloid payout you were hoping to split with me. She blacklisted me, Isabella whispered, the realization crushing her lungs. She annihilated you, Oliver corrected gently. You are completely unhireable in New York, London, or Paris. My advice? Sell that diamond collar Arthur gave you. You'll need the cash to pay the termination fees on that Tribeca lease. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a conference call. Isabella walked out of the office, the bustling sounds of the city rushing past her like a tidal wave. She had tried to play a game meant for titans, assuming her youth and beauty were enough to conquer a kingdom. She had forgotten the most important rule of the elite. Money screams, but wealth, true generational wealth, whispers. And Clara Remington had just whispered her out of existence. The cold reality of a Manhattan winter is merciless, but it is nothing compared to the absolute zero of social exile. By Tuesday afternoon, the shock waves of Clara Remington's Boardroom coup had completely destabilized Arthur's reality. He had been escorted out of the Remington Tower with nothing but a cardboard box containing a few framed photographs and a personalized Mont Blanc pen. His corporate phone was deactivated before the elevator even reached the lobby. Desperate for a safe haven, Arthur instructed his driver a private hire, as the corporate fleet was now forbidden to him to take him to the Peninsula Hotel on Fifth Avenue. He intended to book the Grand Suite, lock himself away, and formulate a counterattack. But when he handed his black American Express Centurion card to the impossibly polite concierge, the machine blinked red. "I apologize, Mr. Remington," the concierge murmured, his eyes betraying a flicker of well-concealed pity. "The card has been declined by the issuer. A hold has been placed on the primary account." Arthur's face flushed a deep, mottled crimson. Clara had not merely taken the company, she had executed a flawless financial siege. She had anticipated his every move, freezing joint assets and leveraging her new majority shareholder status to halt his executive compensation packages. He was a billionaire on paper, but in practice he couldn't even buy a cup of coffee without asking for a handout. While Arthur was arguing with a hotel manager, Isabella Rossi was attempting to liquidate her illusions. Panicked by her blacklist status at Zenith Communications and the looming reality of a $10,000 monthly rent she could no longer afford, Isabella packed her most valuable possessions into an oversized tote bag. She took a subway her first in 4 years down to the Diamond District on 47th Street. She walked into the highly secure, heavily guarded offices of Martin Klein Appraisals. Martin Klein was a legend among the elite, a GIA-certified gemologist who handled discreet liquidations for Upper East Side divorcees and disgraced tech founders. Isabella sat across from Martin in a stark, brightly lit private room. With trembling hands, she placed the heavy velvet box on the table and snapped it open. The Remington collar, the diamond necklace Arthur had presented to her with such fanfare, caught the fluorescent light. "I need to sell this," Isabella said, trying to maintain an air of haughty indifference. Quietly, "And I need a cash advance today." Martin Klein did not smile. He adjusted his jeweler's loop, picked up the heavy collar, and subjected it to a silent, agonizing examination under a specialized halogen lamp. 10 seconds passed, then 20. Martin lowered the loop and looked at Isabella. Miss Rossi, who gave this to you? My former partner. Arthur Remington, she replied, defensive. It was custom-made. Martin sighed, the sound heavy with the exhaustion of a man who had seen this exact tragedy play out 100 times. It is custom-made, yes. The setting is quite exceptional platinum. However, the stones are not diamonds. Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. What? That's impossible. He told me it was worth millions. It is worth perhaps $12,000 for the platinum weight and the craftsmanship, Martin said gently. The stones are high-grade moissanite. Brilliant, flawless, but entirely laboratory-grown. A very common tactic for wealthy men who wish to display a mistress without diminishing their actual liquid assets. This is a spectacular replica of wealth, Ms. Rossi. But it is not wealth. Isabella snatched the necklace back, her chest heaving. Fine. What about this? She pulled the Himalayan crocodile Birkin bag from her tote. It was the bag she had flaunted on Instagram, the ultimate symbol of her triumph over Clara. This is a Hermes VIP exclusive. Unworn. Martin didn't even need the loop for this one. He simply ran his thumb over the stitching on the leather clochette and checked the metallic stamping on the hardware. A super fake, Martin stated flatly. A very high-tier counterfeit, likely sourced from a private dealer in Guangzhou. The blind stamp has the wrong font weight for the year it claims to be produced. I am sorry, Miss Rossi. You have been entirely deceived. Isabella stumbled out of the diamond district, the counterfeit bag heavy on her shoulder, the fake diamonds burning a hole in her pocket. Arthur had not just ruined her career. He had never truly valued her at all. She was merely a cheap accessory he had dressed up in costume jewelry, a pawn in a game she didn't even realize she was losing. Across town, Arthur was discovering the true extent of Clara's legal checkmate. Sitting in a cramped, poorly ventilated office in Lower Manhattan, Arthur glared across a cheap laminate desk at Gregory Houseman, a mid-tier defense attorney who usually handled minor corporate fraud cases. What do you mean you can't get a motion to unfreeze the accounts? Arthur demanded, slamming his fist on the desk. I need the big guns. I need Wachtell, Lipton. I need Cravath. Houseman pushed his thick glasses up his nose, looking at Arthur with a mixture of awe and pity. Mr. Remington, you don't seem to understand the sheer scale of what your wife has done. The morning after the gala, Clara Remington's family trust paid a $50,000 consultation retainer to every single Tier 1 and Tier 2 white-collar defense and divorce firm in the state of New York. Arthur stared at him, uncomprehending. So they're all legally conflicted out, Houseman explained, leaning forward, because they have officially consulted with her on matters pertaining to your estate. They cannot legally represent you. It is a classic ruthless divorce tactic, but executed on a scale I have never seen in my life. She has bought the entire legal shield of Manhattan. You are stuck with me. Before Arthur could scream, Houseman's assistant tentatively opened the office door, holding a thick manila envelope. Mr. Houseman, the assistant whispered, process servers from the SEC are in the lobby. They are asking for Mr. Remington. Arthur's heart completely stopped. The SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission? Houseman tore open the envelope and scanned the first page. The color drained from his face. Arthur, Clara didn't just fire you. She handed the forensic audit of the Dubai acquisition directly to the Southern District of New York. They have flagged the off-the-books loan as wire fraud and investor deception. They are initiating a full federal investigation. You aren't just looking at bankruptcy, Arthur. You are looking at federal prison. Arthur slumped back in the cheap leather chair, the walls of the tiny office closing in on him. He had thought Clara was a soft, forgiving woman who painted watercolors and arranged charity dinners. He had vastly, fatally underestimated the monster he had awakened. 6 months later, The chilling winds of consequence had completely frozen Arthur Remington out of the world he once ruled with absolute impunity. The Southern District of New York does not care about bespoke midnight blue tuxedos or charity ball co-chairmanships. Under the heavy, unforgiving gavel of federal prosecutors, Arthur's sprawling empire dissolved into a devastating mountain of plea deals, gag orders, and asset forfeitures. To avoid a guaranteed 20-year sentence in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, embezzlement, and investor deception under Title 18, Arthur had surrendered everything. The Fifth Avenue penthouse, the sprawling Hamptons estate, the prized collection of vintage European sports cars, all systematically liquidated to pay corporate restitution and staggering SEC fines. He now resided in a cramped two-bedroom walk-up in Queens, a neighborhood with rattling radiator pipes that he previously only viewed from the tinted windows of his private helicopter. His days were spent drinking cheap scotch and aggressively ignoring the relentless calls of debt collectors. One rainy Tuesday, Arthur attempted to walk into the Oak Room at the Plaza Hotel, desperate for a fleeting taste of his past glory. The maître d'hôtel, a man Arthur had personally tipped thousands of dollars over the preceding decade, stepped smoothly to block his path. "I am incredibly sorry, sir," the man said, his voice stripped of any former reverence, his eyes cold and flat. "We are entirely booked for the foreseeable future, and we do not have a wait list." Arthur was left standing alone on the wet pavement of Central Park South, a fading ghost haunting the edges of a high society that had completely, ruthlessly erased him. Isabella Rossi's descent from grace was equally precipitous, though devoid of federal indictments. Without the powerful shield of Zenith Communications, or any PR agency willing to risk Clara's wrath, Isabella became a radioactive pariah in the corporate world. The spectacular Tribeca loft lease, signed in her name because Arthur foolishly wanted to keep it off the books, defaulted in a matter of weeks. The ruthless real estate management group sued her for the remaining multi-million-dollar balance. Stripped of her professional reputation, her bank accounts drained by legal fees and facing crippling litigation, she packed her bags and fled Manhattan in the dead of night. Now she lived in a dreary, overcast suburb outside of Cleveland, Ohio. The brilliant, sharp-tongued PR strategist who once dictated multinational corporate narratives was now managing the chaotic floor of the mid-tier department store cosmetic counter in a dying strip mall. Gone were the custom silk gowns and the glittering, albeit counterfeit, diamonds. Instead, she wore a stiff black polyester uniform and a plastic name tag that constantly dug into her collarbone. Her former colleagues had blocked her on LinkedIn. Whenever a local customer walked in carrying a real luxury handbag, Isabella would feel a sharp, phantom pain in her chest, a brutal daily reminder of the gilded cage she had tried to steal, only to be utterly crushed by its golden bars. But on the 60th floor of the Remington Tower, the sun was shining with the blinding brilliance of absolute, undisputed victory. Clara Remington stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the CEO's suite. The room had been completely gutted and reimagined. Arthur's heavy, oppressive mahogany aesthetic and suffocating cigar smoke had been entirely exorcised. In its place was a temple of power, sleek, minimalist white marble, brushed steel accents, and breathtaking modern art, including a genuine, imposing Rothko canvas secured from an exclusive private dealer. Resting squarely on the center of her immaculate glass desk was the latest issue of the Wall Street Journal, and beside it, the new, highly anticipated issue of Forbes. Clara graced the cover, looking sharp, regal, and entirely untouchable in a structured midnight blues air. The headline was printed in bold, undeniable text, "The Iron Queen: How Clara Remington Orchestrated the Corporate Takeover of the Decade." The soft chime of the intercom broke the silence of the suite. Mrs. Remington, Richard Davies is here for your 2 o'clock meeting. Send him in, Clara said, not turning away from the panoramic view of Central Park, now blooming in the vibrant, arrogant green of early summer. Richard Davies entered, looking incredibly pleased with himself, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He carried a single slim leather portfolio, setting it down gently on the glass desk. The quarterly earnings report is finalized, Clara. The market has responded beautifully to the board restructuring and the new logistics contracts. Stock is up 28% since you assumed total executive control. Excellent work, Richard, Clara said, finally turning to face him. She moved with the languid, terrifying grace of a predator that had recently fed. She poured 2 glasses of sparkling water from a heavy baccarat crystal carafe and handed him one. Richard took a sip, his eyes scanning the immaculate, intimidating office. It remains the most remarkable corporate takeover I have witnessed in my 40-year career. A masterclass in leverage and timing. But Clara, if you don't mind my asking, there is one minor detail that has kept me awake on more than one occasion. Clara arched a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, leaning back against the edge of her desk. Only one, Richard. You must be slipping in your old age. The Dubai acquisition, Richard said, his tone turning conspiratorial, the brilliant lawyer in him desperate to close the final loop of the mystery. Arthur was arrogant, yes, and incredibly reckless in his personal life. But he was fundamentally conservative with corporate capital. He despised high-risk leverage. Yet out of nowhere, he suddenly bet 51% of his life's work on a highly volatile, completely unvetted logistics firm in the Middle East. It was wildly out of character. It was the exact perfect mistake that allowed you to seize the company. Clara walked slowly toward her leather executive chair. She traced the edge of the Forbes magazine with a manicured fingertip, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. Do you believe in luck, Richard? Clara asked softly, the timbre of her voice echoing slightly in the vast room. In our line of work, Mrs. Remington? Absolutely not. Luck is a concept for gamblers, not strategists. Clara's smile widened, transforming into something terrifyingly beautiful. Neither do I. She sat down, crossing her legs, the absolute picture of authority. Arthur did not find the Dubai firm on his own. He lacked the imagination to look beyond his own reflection. About 14 months ago, long before Mistress Rossi came into the picture, but right around the time I noticed Arthur quietly moving funds into private, offshore accounts for his little indiscretions. I had a very quiet, very private lunch with an old friend. Richard leaned forward, captivated. A friend? A senior partner at Goldman Sachs, Clara clarified, casually dropping the name of the financial titan. My friend happened to accidentally mention to Arthur's closest financial advisor that there was a massive, untapped gold mine in Dubai, a once-in-a-lifetime acquisition that required aggressive, immediate capital. A deal that would cement a CEO's legacy forever and make him a legend among his peers. Richard's eyes widened slightly. He stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. You planted the bait, Richard whispered, genuinely awestruck. I planted a seed in a garden of massive, fragile ego, Clara corrected gently. I knew Arthur couldn't resist a legacy project, especially when he was feeling the sting of aging. And when he went searching for the capital to fund this phantom empire, he found that traditional banks wouldn't touch it due to the extreme volatility. So he went to private equity. Richard finished the puzzle, the pieces locking together in his mind with horrifying clarity. He went to Apex Capital. Clara nodded slowly, her eyes locking onto his. Apex Capital, a highly discreet, very aggressive holding firm. A firm that used 3 layers of proxy directors and McCamans. A firm that purely coincidentally was quietly incorporated in Delaware by my grandfather's trust exactly 3 years ago. Richard Davies, a man who had seen the darkest, most ruthless corners of corporate America, actually felt a profound chill run down his spine. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. "You owned the bank," Richard said, his voice barely above a harsh whisper. "You owned the holding firm that lent him the money. You fabricated the Dubai opportunity to force him to seek the loan. You set the aggressive margin call terms in the rider that he never bothered to read. You didn't just catch him in a mistake, Clara. You built the entire maze, placed the cheese, and watched him run blindly right into the trap." Arthur believed that because I arranged floral centerpieces and hosted charity galas, I did not understand the complex logistics of war, Clara said, looking out over the city she now entirely owned, her gaze sweeping over the Manhattan skyline. "He thought betrayal was something you did in a cheap hotel room with a 26-year-old girl. I simply taught him that true, inescapable betrayal is structural." Clara closed the leather portfolio on her desk, the sound snapping like a judge's gavel in the quiet office. "Arthur wanted a new life, Richard," Clara said, her voice dropping to a whisper of absolute, final authority. "I merely provided him with the necessary logistics to get there. Now let us discuss the European merger. I have an empire to run." The billionaire's wife had not simply outshone her husband's mistress. She had rewritten the entire game, burned the old board to ashes, and built a magnificent throne from the embers. In the upper echelons of Manhattan society, whispers still echo loudly, but they no longer whisper about Clara Remington's failing marriage. They whisper about her terrifying, awe-inspiring brilliance, and they make absolutely sure to never ever cross her. If this spectacular tale of high society revenge, corporate espionage, and absolute karma kept you on the edge of your seat, you are not alone. The glittering world of billionaires is often built on secrets, but as Clara proved, the most dangerous secret is a fiercely intelligent woman scorned. We bring you the most scandalous, jaw-dropping, and meticulously researched real-life dramas from the hidden lives of the ultra-wealthy. Do not miss out on our next deep dive into the velvet-lined betrayals of the elite. Hit that like button to show your support for the ultimate queens of karma. Share this video with anyone who loves a flawless comeback story, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell. Your front row ticket to the greatest unscripted dramas of the 1% is just a click away. Thank you for watching, and stay fabulous.